Today we're going to talk about environmental factors and phenotypic variation. And the goal of this video is to describe the effects that things like temperature, altitude, and diet can have on the physical traits that are expressed in genetically identical or genetically similar individuals. So, in previous videos, we've talked about how variation in genotypes, which genotypes being the combination of alleles, how variation in genotypes can cause variation in phenotypes. And phenotypes are the physical characteristics that you see. And we talked about you get some of this genetic variety from things like mutations and certain events during meiosis, like independent assortment and crossing over and non-disjunction. But now we want to talk about how environmental factors can influence the expression of the genotype. And changing the expression of a genotype can cause variation in the phenotype as well. Environmental factors would be things like nutrients or diet, temperature, altitude, and the presence of other organisms. So what I want to do in the remainder of the video is just give you some real life examples of how environmental factors influence the expression of genotypes. And by influencing the expression of those genotypes, you get a variety of phenotypes. So let's first look at the effect of temperature. The sex of some animals is determined by the temperature during their embryonic development. And examples of this would include turtles, crocodiles, and the American alligator. Often, if these eggs are kept incubated at a very high temperature, they produce males. But if the eggs are kept at a very low temperature, this produces females. Now, in some cases, the opposite's true. Now, why would this be useful at all? This kind of temperature-dependent sex determination? This would be useful because it can actually prevent inbreeding. Now, why is that? Well, if all the eggs are kept at about the same temperature, then they'll all be of the same sex. And if they're all of the same sex, this actually prevents inbreeding from happening. You won't have males trying to reproduce with their sisters who are females. If they're all the same sex, they won't be able to reproduce with one another. So that's how this the effect of temperature can actually prevent inbreeding, and it changes the phenotype. The temperature determines whether they develop to be a male or a female. All right, here's another example. So this one's going to be about the effect that other organisms can have on the phenotype of a specific organism. So the sex of some animals is determined by the presence of other individuals of the same species. And examples of this would include some fish and termites. So I'm going to give you the example with the fish here. This is called the sandagger fish. They live in groups where there's only one male in the group, and the others are either they're all females or they're all juveniles. So they're not mature sexually, they can't reproduce yet. Now, in the presence of a male, all the juvenile fish, the very young fish, they'll grow into females. But when the male dies, the dominant female, whoever the dominant female is in the group, the dominant female will turn into a male. So that's an example of how other organisms, in this case the male fish in the group, can affect the phenotype of organisms within this group. Okay, now let me give you an example of how altitude can affect phenotype. So increasing altitude can actually stunt the phenotype of plants, even if the plants have the same genotype. So if you look in this picture at these spruce trees, the spruce trees that are grown at low altitude, so this would be like at the base of the mountain, say, spruce trees grown at the base at low altitude, they're going to grow to their full potential. But the same spruce tree, if it gets grown at a high altitude, like so higher up on the mountain, it will be shorter and it will look a little bit more gnarled up, kind of twisted. The leaves are patchy and so on. And this kind of gradual change in phenotype over an environmental gradient, and in this case, the environmental gradient would be like this incline going up this mountain. A gradual change in phenotype over an environmental gradient is called a cline. So that's what you're seeing here, this line showing this incline. That would be a cline because we're seeing a change in phenotype based on where that line gets drawn. Okay, we'll finish up by talking about the effect that diet can have on the phenotype. So certain diets can actually affect the packaging of DNA through methylation and acetylation. And this packaging of DNA determines which genes are switched on and which are switched off. We've discussed the packaging of DNA in an earlier video. Now, what's neat is that the effects that packaging of DNA can have, those effects can actually be passed on to future generations as well. So here's an example. Near the end of World War II, many people, including pregnant women, were malnourished. They weren't getting the nutrients that they needed. And when the war ended, those same mothers had their diets restored to normal. They were not malnourished anymore. They were getting the nutrients that they needed. But their children that they were pregnant with during the war, when they were malnourished, their children had higher than average rates of obesity and cardiovascular disease. And this is because some of their genes, some of the genes in the children for metabolism, had actually been turned off during development. And this is what caused these complications later. So, to sum up, we've seen how environmental factors like temperature, the presence of other organisms, altitude, and diet, how these can actually affect the phenotype of an individual and even the individual's offspring.